What's going on, filmmakers? Today I'm going to be showing you how you can shoot GoPro footage like this and turn it into this. So I recently went on a ski trip and I brought my GoPro. This is the Hero Session 5, and I also brought this cheap little selfie stick here. And you know, at first glance this stuff might not seem like it's capable of much, but I was able to get some really great results out of it. So here's a sneak peek of the video that I made just using these two tools to show you what's possible. So I hope that just kind of clears up that you don't always have to have the most amazing gear to get great results. This is like a 2-year-old camera at this point, and it's really not that impressive, but with a little creativity, I was still able to make it a very capable camera. So in this video, I just want to break down what all I did to get footage like that out of a cube like this and show you how you can do the same thing with your gear no matter what you're using. So let's get right into it. So I'm going to start off by actually just using my phone. We're going to go through some settings on the GoPro app and dial in everything that I used to record on my GoPro. If you don't want to see this part and you just want to see how I did the editing, then you can skip to the time that I have on the screen right now, and it'll take you over there. What you want to be able to do is max out the resolution and frame rate while still maintaining a linear field of view. I've played around with these settings on mine, and the best that I can do is 1080 at 60 frames per second. And that's what's going to allow me to do a linear field of view. Linear field of view is what will eliminate that nasty GoPro fisheye look that you get in a lot of GoPros. It just makes it look a lot less cinematic. And if you can, I would recommend shooting at least 60 frames per second for action sports, because that'll let you do slow-mo later. I'm actually going to turn off video stabilization because that's going to warp around the footage and make it really hard to stabilize in post. The better option than even doing that in post is just to buy a gimbal. Gimbals will just give you a lot better performance, and you can really make sure that every shot that you have is going to be usable. But if you're cash strapped and you just want to get by with a selfie stick, as long as you hold it still enough, you can still get good results out of it. So I'm turning off video stabilization either way because that's just going to make it really hard to deal with. Also leave low light off because that'll introduce more noise. And spot meter I don't really mess with too much. Pro tune, you definitely want to turn this on. So the white balance and shutter I usually leave on auto just because that's one less thing to worry about, and they usually do a pretty good job. The color, I'm going to change this over to flat if you can, because that's going to give you more flexibility when you're color grading and correcting in post. The ISO limit, I'm going to turn this down to 800 because GoPros have a really small sensor, and the more you crank that up, the more noise you're going to have, and that's just really going to be really ugly. So exposure compensation, I leave in the middle, and then sharpness, I'll actually turn this up to high. Normally you don't want to sharpen GoPro footage too much because it'll end up looking really bad. But for this case, I'm going to turn it up to high because we're going to add motion blur in post, and that'll soften up the image on its own, so we'll end up with a good final product. So that's, as long as you have those settings dialed in, you should be good to go. At this point, we're going to hop over to the computer and I'll show you guys how I work my magic in post. Okay, so welcome to post-production. This is where we're going to work some digital magic and make these clips look better. These are all the clips that I had in that video earlier, but we're not going to focus on all of them. We're just going to do this one in this tutorial. So I'm not going to use any plugins in this tutorial, so don't worry about it costing any money. We're just going to use what Adobe has available for us. So first things first, just make sure you import your clips. I have mine imported over here, but we're just going to focus on this one for now. So I'm going to right click and actually replace this with an After Effects composition. What that's going to do is open the same clip in After Effects, and as we can see, so just drop the exact same clip in here, and this is where we're going to work all our digital magic. So don't worry if you don't already know After Effects. I'm going to walk you through everything you need to do. So first I'm just going to play this clip and see what we have going on here. I'm noticing there's a lot of shake going on here, so this looks really amateurish, and that obviously wouldn't be there if I shot it with a gimbal, but we can try and digitally stabilize this, and the effect for that is warp stabilizer. So if we grab that and drag it onto this clip here, and that's just going to analyze the clip and kind of crop in and do its best to stabilize all the shakes out of there. So it won't always work perfectly, but let's just see how it does here. So it definitely looks smoother to me, but one thing I am noticing here, if we look at the sky up here, there's a lot of stretching going on. It kind of looks like these clouds are doing this weird warping thing. Again, that's just because I didn't shoot this on a gimbal, and that's just the cost of using cheaper equipment. But we can try and mess with this a little bit just to kind of work with that. Usually I don't bring warp stabilizer over like 10% because it looks weird, but let's see how that looks. So actually it kind of looks a little bit more warped out there to me. Yeah, I'm seeing like some rotations here, but also over here in these trees I see more. So I'm actually going to bring that up a little bit, back to 50. This is a rare case where I actually use 50, and you can actually mess around with some of these other settings too, but for my needs I think this is fine. So just be willing to understand it's not always going to work perfectly. I think this is probably about as good as we're going to get it here. I think the next thing we might do is as we zoom in here, you'll notice that the camera moves through the scene pretty fast, but there's like no motion blur back there. Each frame just looks like its own still shot, and that doesn't really look cinematic. It doesn't look like it was shot with a professional camera. But there's actually a cool way that we can add some fake motion blur to this clip in post. So in order to do that, we just need to pre-compose this first. Make sure that you click on Move All Attributes into New Composition. And so that just isolated the warp stabilizer effect. As you can see, it's not there anymore. So the effect that we apply to it now isn't gonna mess with that. So pixel motion blur is what it's called. So if we drag that on there, it's gonna kind of analyze each frame and combine the frames, and it'll basically add motion blur to the spots that are moving, and the spots that are still, it won't. That looks a lot better before and after for me. But if we turn it on from way back here, that's pretty subtle to me. It's almost too subtle. So I'm gonna turn up the shutter angle here. Usually you're gonna wanna leave the shutter angle at like 180 because that's the most natural amount of motion blur. But in this case, I'm okay with cranking it up a little bit because I want this to feel a little bit faster. But one thing you also might notice is that like if you come down here, I'm seeing some weird fringing going on in these poles. You might see some weird lines in your images if you add this effect to it, but it's okay. You can actually just crank up the shutter samples here. This is just gonna combine some more frames and kind of smooth that out. But I think that looks a little bit better to me, just from the before and after. It's you know, it's not perfect, and it would look obviously the most natural if GoPros had a lower shutter speed, but that's not the case. So this is what we have to use. But having it there, in my opinion, is definitely better than not having it at all. So I'm okay with that for now. So at this point, one thing we could do to add some more cinematicness to this shot is widescreen bars. That's just gonna make it look a lot more cinematic. So there's a pretty easy way to do this. If you create a new solid, and then you make sure that it matches your composition width and height. Also make sure that it's black. And so you click OK, and the screen is gonna go black for a second, but don't worry, it's just that new solid that we created covering it up, so we're all good there. So the way to turn this into widescreen bars is just to add the effect CC Jaws. And if we add that to the solid here, and we adjust the completion a little bit, you can see how the Jaws effect gets its name. But if we actually just flatten out the height to 0, then it becomes more like widescreen bars. And if you wanna make this the 2:35:1 ratio, the numbers for that are 78.8. And so that's just gonna give you that nice Hollywood movie look that you see in a lot of films. And that looks a lot better to me. Let's just scroll through here to make sure this all looks good. And one thing I do notice as I get to this point is that our subject here is like really low in the composition. So I'm gonna actually click on the original clip and press P to open the position. And then if we raise this up just a little bit, you can see we can kind of readjust the framing. So that's the nice thing about widescreen bars. You can adjust your composition after the fact. So nice little perk there. But one more thing I might add to this is a little bit of color correction. I've never been a huge fan of GoPro colors, but there's an effect in here called Lumetri Color. A lot of people like to use plugins for color grading, but I honestly think that Lumetri Color does the job just fine. So we're gonna use that here, but you can use whatever you want. So first thing I'll do is add some contrast here. Always adjust the exposure first and then the colors, because exposure actually messes with the colors. If we bring the highlights up here a tad, and then we can drop the shadows. Just want them to be dark enough. I think maybe right there looks good. And then I also noticed this footage looks kind of warm. I'd rather have it feel a little bit more cool since we're on a mountain, so I'm gonna drop the temperature to -10 here. That should give us a better, yeah, that looks a little bit cooler, so I like that. And then I might just drop the blacks a little bit more too, and that's looking better to me. So overall, yeah, a good color correction, I'm happy with that. I think if you wanted to take it a step further, you could add a color grade to this, and I might just do that real quick. So I'll just do a subtle version of the orange and teal. It's a pretty popular look, I'm a fan of it. So we'll bring the shadows down to the blue and then the midtones back up to the orange to kind of balance that out. And that just puts more color into the shadows and highlights, and it just adds this nice, more cinematic feel. So that looks good. The last thing we could do to this, if you wanted to, is add slow motion. But we actually need to export this first because we need to use frame blending to get it slow enough. I shot this in 60 frames per second, but I want to slow it down even more than that. And so I would need to use frame blending for that, but it's not available since this is a pre-composition. So if we export that into its own new clip, then we'll be able to actually apply that effect to it. So I'm just gonna come up here to File, and I'm gonna export this, add it to the queue real quick. And I just added it to the queue here. So I'm just gonna export this and I'll come back when it's done. So it just finished up exporting and I just imported it here. So let's just play this to make sure it's the right one. So yeah, it has the color correction, the motion blur, and stabilization, so we should be good to go. We can drag this new clip down and create a new composition with it. And I'm actually gonna adjust the frame rate of this real quick because I don't want it to be super smooth, 60 frames per second. So we're gonna drop that to 29, or basically 30. And then I'm actually gonna also extend this to about 6 seconds. And that's just gonna give us some more room in the timeline to work with so that we can extend it out to slow motion. So for this part, what you'll do is go to the part where you want it to start the slow motion. So I think maybe like right here, right before he starts shredding some powder there. And I'll just come up here to time and then enable time remapping. Click on this button right here and it'll create some keyframes. So I put that there, and then I'll also find where I want it to come out of it. So maybe like right here where he stops shredding the pow. And then I'll just come over here, bring this out a bit, and then extend this. And that's gonna slow down this whole middle section. So that looks much better to me, but I think it could still be a little bit slower. If I grab these and drag them out even more, that increases the time here that it goes from point A to point B. And so that does look a lot slower, but you will notice that it doesn't look quite as smooth now. That's just because there's not enough frames to work with in this time span to make it look smooth. So that's where the frame blending effect comes in, which is what I was talking about earlier. So this is the frame blending effect right here. And if you click this on, it'll just start creating new frames in between all of the dead frames there. And so that's gonna kind of help smooth things out. There's a couple different ways you can do this. One is it'll analyze 2 frames and then overlay them on top of each other. And we need to click the enable button here so that it actually works. But let's just see how that does. So I don't like the way this looks. It kind of gives this weird like layer effect. So I'm actually gonna click the second one here and just see how that looks. And this is different because it actually analyzes the frames and then creates new ones in the middle that are just completely like artificial. But sometimes I think it works a little bit better, so let's just see how this works. So this all looks good to me. I think it looks a lot better than where we started. But one more thing that we could do just to add some icing on the cake here is, you'll notice that this goes straight from normal motion to slow motion. It just jumps straight to it, and that's kind of harsh. So we can actually fix that just by adding some ease-ins. So I'll do an easy out there and an ease in here. And then if we come to the graph editor, just click on one of the keyframes and then click on the graph editor. And then we grab these gravity pull things here and just kind of align them to the original direction of the clip speed. Same with the second one here. What it'll do is ramp down from the original speed and kind of ease into the slow motion and then ramp back out of it. And so that's just gonna give it a little bit more of a smoother effect, but let's just see how that turned out here. And that looks pretty cool to me. I like that a lot better. I am noticing if you look closely at the snow, it doesn't look totally natural. It looks kind of fake here. That's just because, again, we're using artificial stuff to make this all happen, and it doesn't always do a perfect job. But I think it definitely looks better than where we started. So at this point, we can come back to Premiere and just import that sequence that we just created with the slow motion. So you go to Adobe Dynamic Link, import After Effects Comp, and let me find it here real quick. Bring it onto the timeline. At this point, you can add music or do the whole fancy transitions thing that I had at the beginning. So that's all the GoPro tips that I got for you in this video. Thanks for watching. And again, my point with this video is just that it's not always about the gear that you're using, because some skills and creativity can make things look good on any budget. So with that being said, if you got some value out of this video, I would appreciate a like below. Or if you have any other GoPro tips you want to share, leave them in the comments. If you know somebody who could use some GoPro tips like this, feel free to share this video with them. And lastly, if you're into filmmaking or content creating, consider subscribing, because I am starting a channel all about that kind of stuff. So with that being said, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate you, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.